Hey everyone, I'm Peyton Williams, and welcome to the second episode of our series on baseball in Kansas. Today we'll be covering from 1870 to 1900. Throughout the 1870s, baseball clubs continued to pop up throughout Kansas, along with reports of women, African Americans, and American Indians playing the sport. It's important to remember that there's a notable absence in early public record when it comes to the activities and histories of minority groups. This is an unfortunate fact to which baseball is not exempt. Especially when it comes to black and female Kansans, they were likely playing baseball as early as their white counterparts, but we don't see reports of them playing until the late 1860s and 1870s, and consistent and accurate reports until much later. A handful of black baseball clubs appeared on the scene at the end of the 60s. The first recorded game between two black teams was in 1868 between teams from Leavenworth and Lawrence, and the first interracial game took place just 2 years later in Fort Scott. In 1874, the Colored Star Club of Fort Scott beat the Clippers, a white team, which led to a great deal of bitterness and resentment on behalf of the latter team, who refused to play another black team from then on. Black teams continued to form and play throughout the following decades, often appearing as unnamed teams mentioned in the local paper. Integrated teams with multiple races represented, appeared as early as the 80s in public record, beginning with a black player named Isaac Perkins, who played for an otherwise all-white team in Junction City in 1885. At first, baseball playing amongst women was discouraged, due to concern that the sport was too strenuous and unladylike. Women were, of course, encouraged to attend games. Because of this, women's baseball didn't truly start to appear in any official capacity in the state until the 1880s, though some independently organized games occurred throughout the 70s in Wichita. Some of these early games were organized as fundraisers, using the novelty of watching women play to raise money for the school or local library. American Indians, on the other hand, were playing their own stick and ball games, including a version of lacrosse long before Kansas Territory was even established. However, in 1877, we see the first recorded instance of American Indians playing baseball in Kansas when a team of Pawnee Scouts played a group of Fort Hays soldiers. Not many baseball games including or amongst the Kansas tribes were recorded throughout the 70s and 80s, though the few that were witnessed by the public were highly anticipated and widely gawked at. It wasn't until the 1890s that American Indian baseball teams began to emerge from some of the institutes in the area, most notably the Kickapoo Training School and the Haskell Institute. A few of the teams were particularly successful, including the 1897 and 1904 Kickapoo team, drawing crowds and even soliciting a few invitations to play out of state. Club baseball continued to grow in the 70s, especially in the hubs of Lawrence and Topeka, with some additional standout teams hailing from Leavenworth, Wichita, and even Emporia. In the mid-70s, one Topeka team called the Topeka Westerns was very successful, trouncing teams throughout the state and only suffering one loss between the years of 1874 to 1876. By the 80s, the club baseball played amongst businessmen during the 60s and 70s began to evolve into a more accessible version of the sport for the average player. Towns throughout the state began fielding their own teams that would play against other teams in the surrounding area. Though the games were sparse at first, this nonetheless proved a unifying activity, bringing locals together in the wake of the Civil War and in the midst of all the tensions and complications that came with settling the frontier territory of western Kansas. Teams would hold fundraisers to raise money for the cost of travel and supplies, or they'd be sponsored by a local business or two. Baseball, which was already being played casually on college campuses across the state, officially became a collegiate game in 1880, when university teams from Lawrence faced off against each other. College ball proved to be the inroad for women's baseball in Kansas, as Washburn fielded its first women's team in 1886, and many other colleges developed their own teams soon after. The mid-1880s was the baseball boom in Kansas. As popularity for the sport continued to climb, in '86, two Kansas teams, one from Topeka and one from Leavenworth, entered into the Western League, a six-club minor league that spanned across multiple states. Unfortunately, both teams got crushed in their first year. However, interestingly, the Topeka squad was an all-white team except for its second baseman, a black man by the name of Bud Fowler, born John Jackson. Born in New York, Fowler played for 20 minor league teams across the states during his career and is widely regarded as the first black professional player. After a rough first year in the Western League, a group of Topeka financiers got together and decided to fund a club that would put the capital city on the map. Thus came the formation of Goldsby's Golden Giants. The Golden Giants was one of the most talented, most expensive, and most short-lived teams in Kansas history. The team had several star players, including its player-manager, Walt Goldsby, who had previously played for the Washington Nationals and went on to play for the Baltimore Orioles, and James "Bug" Holliday, previously an outfielder and home run hitter for the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Even though the Western League expanded to 8 teams and then 10 midway through the 1887 season, it was no matter. The Golden Giants obliterated the competition, securing the title of Western League champions. However, due to a dip in the economy and the team's astronomically high price tag, the glorious Golden Giants only lasted for a single season. Throughout the 80s, the rules of baseball began to solidify into the rules we recognize today. First of all, pitchers were allowed to throw overhand beginning in 1884. Also in 84, the concept of limiting the amount of unhittable pitches came into play. Now, after 6 pitches outside of the strike zone, or balls, the batter would walk to first base. The number of balls and strikes permitted fluctuated throughout the 80s, but by 1889, the modern rule of 4 balls takes a base and 3 strikes you're out came into effect. Up until and even into the 1890s, integrated teams were playing ball throughout the state, especially in southeast Kansas. Whether a white team supplemented their roster with a few talented black players or a town team featured black men from the area on the squad, integrated ball was not an uncommon practice throughout the Midwest until the mid-90s. Around this time, sentiments began to sour towards integrated teams, and they swiftly became far less common. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, providing legal legitimacy to separate but equal everywhere, including on the baseball field. From the years of 1895 to 1899, Kansas fielded the most integrated minor league clubs of any state in the U.S., but by the early 1900s, the vast majority of teams were segregated. This feels a bit like a step backwards, but this cultural and political shift also gave rise to Negro League baseball, which got its start in the early 1900s. At the turn of the century, baseball was being taken increasingly seriously. Professional and semi-professional teams continued to appear, and the market for the game continued to grow. It was also around this time that the space was dropped, and baseball simply became known as baseball. In many ways, it felt like a reinvention, a new name just in time for a new era of baseball. Thanks for tuning in to episode 2. Next time we'll learn about barnstorming, Sunday baseball, and Kansas's ties to the Negro Leagues. Till next time.